in Scotland's webinar. Our webinar today on Ireland, punching above its weight. I'm David Clark, and I'll be hosting today's meeting for you all, and we're delighted to have so many of you along. Now, I had a rather long-winded introduction, but due to the misbehaviour, put it mildly, of the Belarusians over the past 24 hours, Tony Connolly, one of our speakers, who's the RTE correspondent for Europe, the European editor, he has got to jump off and deal with this for the news. So luckily we have him for about 15 minutes. So I'm now going to pass immediately over to Tony, where hopefully he can give us a bit of a talk on just from his perspective, covering Ireland and its interaction with the EU. Why is Ireland punched above its weight, Tony?
Thank you very much, David. And yes, apologies for the events elsewhere in Belarusian airspace. I have to get back to finish an edit for the 6 o'clock news. But you know, when we talk about Ireland and the EU, I mean, until Brexit, you had two kind of narratives. One was the classical narrative about Ireland being an agrarian society and economy heavily dependent on the UK, you know, somewhat protectionist for the first decades of its existence from the 1920s until the 1960s. Then you had a bit of a transformation under Sean Lemass, the Taoiseach at the time, which opened Ireland up. And then you had entry into the EEC, which was entirely coordinated, if you like, with Britain's entry. The two economies were so closely linked, and you had all sorts of other historical and migratory links as well, that it just wouldn't have been possible otherwise. And you saw a gradual arc of Ireland's economy improving right into the 1980s, even though there were terrible doldrums in the 1980s, until the 1990s, when I think a combination of hard-earned reforms at government level on social welfare, on industrial peace, and the combination of that with the opening of the EU single market and some educational reforms that were introduced in the late 60s, which started to bear fruit in the 90s. All of those created a perfect storm of what we then called the Celtic Tiger, Ireland being a much better educated, much more productive, much more high-skilled, much more high-tech economy that was on the doorstep of the European single market. That could then take advantage of foreign direct investment, using Ireland as a doorstep or a launch pad into the EU single market. And combined with that, again, of course, you had the very favorable corporate tax culture that goes back some decades. And this was accompanied by a growing sense of sovereignty that was detaching itself from under the shadow of its relationship with the UK. And domestically as well, you had the peace process and a much more benign environment on the island of Ireland. And so all of this was kind of good news. Ireland was known to host fairly successfully European presidencies. Irish diplomacy had a knack of mixing the formal, the professional, the business, and the political with the informal. And of course, you know, with English as our primary language of interaction, you know, we had a certain advantage there as well. And so all of these things conspired to give Ireland, you know, a very positive place in the European Union. But then, of course, you had the financial crash in 2008, and you had a bailout for Ireland because of really extravagant lending by a number of financial institutions, and what seemed to be a fairly lax regulatory culture in Ireland in terms of lending. Not just in Ireland, I mean, this was true in a lot of other Western countries, but Ireland paid the price because of the property bubble at that time. And so suddenly we were, from being the poster boys of the Celtic Tiger, we then became the awkward spendthrift country which had got itself into terrible trouble and had to be rescued by the EU and the IMF. But despite tremendous domestic opposition and unhappiness at the bailout, I think Ireland's economy was sufficiently flexible and well managed for the country to rebound fairly quickly, certainly a lot quicker than Greece's economy did. And for that reason, we were again seen as the poster boys of the bailout years. And the economy had only kind of really got back onto its feet in 2014, 2015, when then the Brexit referendum happened. And as we know now, the Irish government could, to an extent, perhaps less than is people think nowadays. I mean, a lot of the worries that the Irish government had in the run-up to the referendum were about just bilateral trade with the UK, because it was still very important for certain sectors. But certainly the Irish government and the Department of Foreign Affairs identified a real risk to the Northern Ireland peace process, because before the referendum and even in the weeks afterwards, it wasn't clear what kind of Brexit we were going to get. Was it going to be a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit? And the Irish government did quite a lot to try and convince David Cameron to up his game, to raise the Northern Ireland issue. You had ministers, even the Taoiseach and the Kenny, going to the UK to push a Remain vote as far as protocol would permit, because of their basic argument was that if you want stability in Northern Ireland to continue and for prosperity to continue, then it's more or less better that the UK stays in the EU. Now this was an argument that obviously didn't get enough purchase in the UK. Even established Irish communities were often harbored a lot of people who voted for Brexit. But once the referendum happened, the Irish government had to embark on a pedagogical exercise to inform both institutions in Brussels and other member states about the nature of the Irish peace process, the particularly toxic situations around the Irish border, what it could mean for the Irish border if Britain left the single market and the customs union, and how that had to be avoided, not just for Ireland's own selfish strategic reasons, but also because the EU had invested a lot of money in the peace process, and it was actually seen as one of the European Union's quiet success stories at foreign policy level. I mean, this was obviously following, the peace process in Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement followed the terrible times of the Balkan Wars. And I think the EU felt that this was a process worth investing in politically, perhaps much more quietly than the Americans had done under Bill Clinton. And indeed, the regional and peace funding that was poured into Northern Ireland was seen around the world as a template for how you can use funding carefully to foster reconciliation. I mean, the model of regional and peace funding used was actually presented to the Colombian government when they were dealing with FARC guerrillas, for example. So for that reason, while there were impulses within the Irish government to try and forge a bilateral consensus with the UK government, it was clear pretty quickly that Ireland had to outsource its Brexit strategy to the European Commission, that this was going to be a negotiation between London and Brussels, and Ireland had to make sure that Brussels understood the complexities and the nuances of the Irish peace process in order for the institutions and member states to support Ireland. It wasn't all plain sailing. Member states wanted to be sure that they weren't getting entangled in something that might, blow up in their faces later. Whether that's now the case remains to be seen with the kind of noises from unionism and the British government. But certainly, I think there's an instinct in the European Union not to tamper with constitutional situations in member states. And the Irish government, I think, had to work very hard to explain their position, explain the nature of this weird border that sort of snakes and winds its way across the island of Ireland, how the two sides of the border had turned their backs on each other largely for 60, 70 years until the peace process. And now, because of the Good Friday Agreement, and Katie Hayward has written a lot about this, there was an opening up at economic and social level across the land border that could be done quietly without too much fanfare. And that was really what was now in jeopardy. And also, just to come back to the EU funding aspect, strangely enough, if there was American funding coming into Northern Ireland, unionist communities tended to be skeptical about it, whereas European funding for reconciliation and peace tended to be regarded as neutral. Now, to take a kind of a big stride forward in the chronology, the template of the European Union's adoption of the Irish position was in April 2017, when the European Council adopted the negotiating guidelines, and paragraph 12, I think, of those guidelines spelled out very clearly the ambition of the European Union to preserve the peace process, to avoid a hard border. And there was a famous ABC, the achievements, benefits, and commitments of the Good Friday Agreement, which was language that is not necessarily kind of anodyne language. That was deliberately put in there by the Irish government to spell out to people that the Good Friday Agreement isn't just a kind of a one-off agreement that is there and everybody moves on. The agreement provided a zone of peace and prosperity on the island of Ireland that needed to be minded going forward for year on year. So the achievements were the peace process, the benefits were peace and prosperity, and the commitments, the ABC, the C of the commitment was the commitments, and that was to make sure that this zone of peace and prosperity would expand, going forward. And of course, Brexit just threw a big kind of barrier into that whole equation.
Tony, I realize you've made yourself scarce. So this time that we have with you is extremely valuable. And thank you for, there's a couple of points I'd love to cover with you before you're forced to run on.
I've got a few minutes, I think.
Yeah, particularly important. I think I think one of the things is you covered it. If you're looking at Twitter, you seem to know stuff that was going on before Theresa May or before Jean-Claude Juncker. One of the things, but my point is that you're very intimate. What the way the Irish played things. Now, you mentioned about diplomacy there. You mentioned about the informal and the formal. I don't know whether that's a euphemism for drink or something. But what do the Irish do? What do the Irish do that managed to get them to that stage? To the stage where they had such influence.
I mean, I think part of it was the fact that the Irish government was being led by Fine Gael at this time. So you have the pathway to Berlin through the European People's Party. There was also a belief that Ireland had really taken a hit for the European Union during the bailout, and it needed to be nurtured and looked after. And I suppose as well, the fact that Ireland was going to stay as an English-speaking country with a relatively young population that was pro-EU, that in itself, in the immediate aftermath of Brexit, is not something that you would necessarily disregard. So I think for all those reasons that helped. But the professionalism of the Department of Foreign Affairs has to be applauded, I think, as well, and the networks that they had managed to develop. I think in particular Declan Kelleher, who was the firm rep throughout this time, who had very good relations with the Commission and with people like Jeppe Tranholm Nicholson, who's the Secretary General of the Council. And you had some key people in and around the Council and the institutions who were, Irish officials who were playing an important role. And also I think the fact that Michel Barnier had a natural instinct on Ireland from his time as Regional Affairs Commissioner back in the early 2000s, but also as he's written in his book, that strangely enough, the trip that President de Gaulle made to Ireland to Kerry in 1969, just before he resigned as president. Michel Barnier talks about that in his book quite a bit. I don't know if he's playing that up a little bit, who knows, but I think there were lots of reasons why Ireland was able to capitalize on the goodwill that was there, and then it had a certain professionalism, and then ultimately when it came down to it, and there's one fairly instructive episode where at that council meeting where the EU agreed Michel Barnier's negotiating mandate, they also agreed to put wording into the minutes of that meeting that should Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland ever be united through a referendum on the United Ireland, then Northern Ireland would automatically, qualify to be a full part of the EU. And there was tremendous lobbying by Downing Street to prevent that from happening. And the message went back from the council to say that if the Irish want this, they're getting it. They're in the room, you're not, kind of thing. So there was a kind of straightforward realpolitik there, and an awareness that if you're going to choose between the sort of sensitivities here, then Ireland's a member state, and the sort of solidarity impulse kind of kicks in there.
Can I ask just quickly again before you go? I'm going to have 1,000,001 final questions. This is my final question to you. But in terms of where we are now, because I interrupted you in the chronology of it, I'm interested just, do you think from an Irish perspective now, is Ireland got to pay back now? Is there kind of like, you talked about the exchange there, you did something during the financial crisis, you got a support in Brexit. Is there now a thing, Ireland, time to pay back? Is that how it works?
Like nobody will say that out loud, and I'm not sure if that's how things really work. I mean, famously back in 2000, I think in 11, Enda Kenny's first summit, he had a stand-up exchange of words with Nicolas Sarkozy, who was criticizing Ireland for its corporate tax policy and kind of saying, well, we've bailed you out, so time to sort of toe the line on taxation. It has never come about in that overt way. Yes, of course, at the moment there is an international move on taxation. The American administration, the Biden administration wants to bring in a minimum corporate tax rate. That's going to undermine Ireland's position. The European Commission has once again launched a corporate tax framework that will be rolled out over the next couple of years to take account of OECD moves on taxation and reflecting the Biden administration's moves. I think Ireland is always feeling a bit of discomfort on this front, but they're not alone in absolutely insisting that taxation is a national competence, and again we'll see how far that one gets, but I don't think there's a crude transaction that Ireland now has to kind of abide by the prevailing winds on something like taxation.
And just finally, I suppose, just really the absolute final question there. You talked about the professionalism of the Department of Education, but you did tack back. You were talking about the education. Do you think learning of foreign languages? Do you think was that quite important? Is that important? Have the Irish done that? Try to engage, in the languages through their Department of Foreign Affairs?
Foreign Affairs. It's a good question. I mean, there is a real push now at government level to increase the numbers of Irish officials getting into, or Irish people getting into EU institutions. I mean, we've got, I think there's several dozen senior Irish officials in the institutions who are due to retire in the next 5 or 6 years, and the intake has been very slow. I mean, I think alongside Denmark, we have the lowest intake or the lowest numbers of people who are passing the concours and getting selected for senior functionary positions. So the government is putting money into languages, and they're going to be fast tracking civil servants into the institutions on secondment, and they're trying to fast track people into the College of Europe in Bruges. But I think it's true that during the past before Brexit, and even in recent years before the pandemic, a lot of Irish graduates were just being tempted into the big tech companies and not necessarily wanting to go off and perfect a new language and get into to move to Brussels. So I think there's a big effort now to try and change that.
Okay. Well, look, I know you've got to go and sort out the bigger problems in the world at the moment. So if you get first dibs on what's going on in that, you'll message us and let us know.
Absolutely.
So at least we can break that to the people here on the call.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
For that,
Thanks,
Tony.
David.
Not
Thanks
at all.
guys.
Thanks.
See you, Pat. See you, Bridget. See you, Pat. Thank you. Cheers. See you, David.
So I suppose now I can go into the wider introduction there for all of you joining. Thank you very much for joining, etc., etc., etc. I mean, I think Tony's introduced quite a lot of the topics that we wanted to talk to there. I should explain, I'm David Clark, by the way. I'm Vice Chairman of the European Movement in Scotland. And below the accent, I'm actually representing Scotland here today, but I've worked quite a lot in between Scotland and Ireland, most recently, trying to get the financial services of both countries working together. And we do have a lot to learn from each other. And I think that's the real point of what we're trying to do today, is learn maybe from what the Irish experience has been very successfully in this area. And I think it's fair to say as well, of course, that the Irish have been highly successful. I mean, Tony went through a few things there. I think most significantly, the way Ireland really managed to get the European Union to have Ireland's back during the negotiations over Brexit. But even since then, The Economist magazine, I think, said recently that Ireland, in terms of its size in relation to its diplomatic power, was probably the most powerful country in the world. So that's real success there. And I'm coming from an Irish person who grew up in the 70s and 80s when it was, we weren't so successful. I think the transformation is something that I'd love to ask our two next speakers about. So with that in mind, I'm going to go to Brigid Laffan. I'm just going to introduce Brigid here. She's an expert on all things European, having shaped and articulated the studies of Europe and its bodies for more than 2 decades. She was founder director of the European Institute at University College Dublin. And while at UCD, she was promoted to vice presidency and principal of the College of Human Sciences. However, since 2013, she has worked at the prestigious Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies, where she is director and professor. She's also director of the Global Governments Program at the European University Institute in Florence, which I think is her background when she comes on. And her contribution was recognized in 2010 when she was awarded the Ordre National du Mérite by the President of France. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Brigid to give her presentation on the topic here. Hi, Brigid.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion. I'm not sure Ireland punches above its weight, but it certainly, when it wants to, and it's very selective, it certainly punches at its weight. But let me contextualize that in talking a little about small states, because the EU has a lot of small states, 22 in all. And small states, unlike large states, can't necessarily use hard power over power. So they've got to find and navigate a way through a complex world. And in the literature, there tends to be 2 different ways in which small states do this. Firstly, Peter Katzenstein's work on small states in global markets, where he argues that small states must have domestic capacity of adaptability. In other words, they must try to ensure a good fit between domestic policy and the world out there. But there's also a second strain of thought, and that is geopolitics, and the importance of small states in seeking shelter or scaffolding in order to deal with the world. So in my view, both matter. For Ireland and for other small states, their domestic policies must be aligned with the world outside, because if they're not, there's trouble ahead. But secondly, small states need scaffolding anchors in the world. And for Ireland, the essential anchor in the world today is membership of the European Union. Without a doubt, Ireland has made a decisive choice for Europe. It is the geopolitical anchor that Ireland deals with the rest of the world. But of course, small states, and I know David mentioned Greece earlier, and I'm speaking tomorrow at a panel on Greece, and there is an extraordinary contrast between the Greek experience of membership and the Irish experience of membership. And that comes down to what I would call learning to live with internationalization. Because EU membership is only an opportunity. It doesn't deliver automatically to any country. It's an opportunity. It's a tough competitive environment in market terms. And so a state cannot afford to join the EU and think the EU solves its problems. It is simply an opportunity, and a country to flourish in the EU must take that opportunity. Two important features of Ireland's membership. Firstly, Ireland joined with a high level of domestic consensus on the issue of membership. There was an 80% plus consent of the people. It was the will of the Irish people to join. That mattered. And secondly, it did not lead to any splits in major political parties that have completely dogged UK membership and to a lesser extent Danish membership, but particularly the UK. It was divisive for the Labour Party and then the Conservative Party. In Ireland, the one parliamentary party that opposed the Labour Party went into government with Fine Gael in 1973 and automatically accepted the will of the people. So the absence of serious domestic dissent on the issue of Europe has really mattered to Ireland's membership. The second thing I should say about Ireland is Ireland was the first wholly poor state to join the EU. In 1973, Ireland had a per capita income average of 65%. In other words, the EU membership was about convergence, catch-up and modernization. And so we were the benchmark for all those other poor states that joined later. It is significant to point out that to date, Ireland is the only poor state that has surpassed per capita incomes of the EU. In other words, and I know there's the GNI GDP argument, but Ireland is the one country that has caught up. Others have converged significantly, but Ireland has caught up. So that, again, Ireland took advantage of the opportunities of membership, but I will argue that that took some time. That was neither immediate or automatic. And also Ireland came off, when it joined in 1973, of a period where Ireland had underperformed, particularly in the 1950s, but also Irish growth levels lagged those of Greece and Spain and Portugal, even in the 1960s. So then how do we explain Ireland's success of membership? And the other thing I should say is that Helmut Schmidt once asked Garrett Fitzgerald, said, oh, Ireland, the EU does a lot for Ireland. Can you tell me what Ireland does for the EU? And Garrett was very flustered by the question and didn't have a good answer, but I think the answer is very clear. The Irish contribution to European integration has been to show that a peripheral poor state can flourish in a highly competitive market. And that's a tremendous contribution to European integration, because the EU has never been a club of the rich. It has successively opened its doors to much poorer countries. So then on to why the success. So I would say that Ireland's apprenticeship in the system was over as early as 1975, and that was very good. It was over because Ireland held its first presidency in 1975, but it used the social fund and the common agricultural policy to firstly improve farm incomes and dilute any urban-rural split, but also that investment in education. Irish administration adapted extremely well in the early years. And that manifested itself then in 1975 when the United Kingdom held a referendum to stay or to go. And it was clear within 2 years Ireland would never have left or followed the UK out as early as 1975. It was not the Brexit referendum. But Ireland had a very tough 1980s. It didn't get its public finances under control. There was high unemployment, high inflation, and a vicious economic cycle. And that came at a time when the EU was embarking on the major project of the single market. And then there was in Ireland deep anxiety about Ireland's capacity to flourish in that single market. As it turns out, all those fears were unfounded, because in fact, the single market was really good to Ireland. It was really good because Ireland was an export state, number one, and it dramatically increased the flow of multinational investment into the Irish economy with the bridge to the European market. So from the end of the 1980s to the early 2000s, you see the vicious cycle being replaced by a virtuous cycle. And an important feature of that was at the end of the 1980s, the decision to have a formal social partnership in Ireland. In other words, the Katzenstein appropriate domestic mechanisms of adjustment. You also had the investment in education began to bear fruit as the Irish economy expanded and there were more jobs. There was also untapped female labour to join the labour market, and the structural funds mattered. They allowed Ireland invest again. So interestingly, it's in this period that Ireland overtakes Wales and Scotland in per capita terms. So it begins to, Irish independence is vindicated. It's better to be an independent state in the EU than a regional part of the United Kingdom, and membership of the single market. So those two, independence and the single market, were very important. And then it, of course, I won't say much about the bailouts, other than Ireland moved from interdependence in the EU to dependence. That was an extraordinary shock to the Irish state elite. They responded, the Troika arrived, but the Troika arrived on Irish terms. What do I mean by that? Ireland continued to have agency. It engaged, half of the fiscal consolidation happened before the Troika arrived, and the Troika numbers were actually numbers contained in the Irish recovery document itself. So what did the Irish do? They decided, firstly, the first goal was to get the Troika out of the country as quickly as possible, one bailout. And the strategy was to do everything below the radar. So hit the targets and ask for adjustments. So the Irish asked for the Irish minimum wage to be put back up to its level. So Ireland actually managed to agency with the Troika. The one area that was very problematic and had a political cost was the engagement with the ECB. Why? Because Ireland's problems began in the banks. It was a very expensive bank bailout, and there was an attempt to burn some of the bank, at least to handle some of the bondholders. But the ECB were very worried about fiscal stability or financial stability in Europe. And by that stage, most of the bondholders were gone anyway. So they were not, there was quite a standoff between the Irish government and the ECB won. Now, on the upside, Ireland went back into the markets in 2013, and very quickly the sovereign signature was back and Ireland was borrowing at very low rates. Then we come to Brexit. So Brexit took Ireland out of its comfort zone. What do I mean by that? Up to then, Ireland used focus on its key priorities in the EU, negotiation by negotiation by negotiation. But now Ireland was forced to put an Irish issue center stage on the European agenda and ask for the solidarity of European institutions and 26 other countries. And that took Ireland, Ireland was a demandeur, but it is a textbook case of extraordinary diplomatic and political, and it was both diplomatic and political influence. It shows Ireland's state capacity, both at political level and at diplomatic level, that with speed, but of course with a very compelling argument, it got Ireland as one of the first 3 issues. Now, why was that important? It was important because the UK, London wanted Northern Ireland to be treated in the future relationship. And that would have been extremely dangerous for Ireland, because Northern Ireland would have been held hostage to a London government that had not paid attention to the costs and consequences of Brexit for the island of Ireland. And so the Irish government was determined at any cost it would take the risk, and at several times in these negotiations, it looked as if a no deal would happen because of Northern Ireland. And yet the Irish held their nerve. And in my view, they were right, because had they not held their nerve, the situation in Northern Ireland, which has been destabilized by Brexit, would, in my view, be even worse. So there's no good Brexit for the island of Ireland. Interestingly, economically, I'm very struck by the speed with which the connectivity to the continent has changed. The Irish economy is simply going round the UK, but Northern Ireland remains the vulnerability and the real danger. Now, just to quickly sum up, I would say that EU membership has in some ways vindicated Irish independence 100 years ago. The choice to be in and out of Europe as a state mattered, and the EU will remain Ireland's essential choice. Now, Ireland needs good relations with London to manage Northern Ireland, and also the links, the social, cultural and human links between the 2 countries. But that will not be done at the expense of Ireland's membership of the EU. On the future, big ticket items, corporate tax, the Green Deal, but one should not underestimate the resilience of the Irish state, or in my view, its people, to handle whatever EU membership throws at it in the future. It has a poor, vulnerable state has managed to find its feet in a world of complex interdependence, and has done so in a way that could not have been necessarily predicted in 1922.
Thanks very much for that, Brigid. That is a fabulous introduction from your perspective there. And lovely view that you've got in the background there. Unfortunately, we're now going to divert to probably a Dublin, I think Pat Cox's Dublin office, which is not as sunny, but I'm sure from the intellect will be just as fascinating. Pat is probably one of Ireland's best known politicians and statesmen. He's a former journalist, hosting one of Ireland's top current affairs programmes, Today Tonight, in the 1980s. But he left the comfortable world of asking politicians himself to move over to the other side, where he would be grilled himself as a politician. He sat in Ireland's Parliament for the Progressive Democrats, a party which was fervently European in its outlook. And he later became a member of the European Parliament, serving on several key committees. In 1998, he was elected president of the Liberal grouping of the European Parliament. And then in 2002, he was elected president of the European Parliament itself, a very prestigious job. And I suppose demonstrating our point about the Irish punching above their weight. He held that role until 2004. And since then, he's held a number of roles, including president of the European Movement International, of which we are part. And more recently, he's taken a keen interest in helping Ireland's drive to become a leader in sustainability. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Pat Cox.
David, thank you very much for the introduction. And I want to thank the European Movement Scotland for the invitation to join you. It's not my first time to talk to the European Movement Scotland, but it is a long time since I've had the pleasure to do so. I might start, if I may, with a small personal reflection on being elected to the presidency of the European Parliament and what it meant to me in terms of Irishness more than what it meant to me in terms of one's own person. And really to reflect a little bit on how all this stuff, not to do with my presidency of the Parliament, but how all these issues of Ireland in Europe that have been so well articulated already, give us some glimpse of our own sense of identity. And we know that identity, of course, matters an awful lot in politics, and perhaps even this idea of identity or kind of culture-based politics of the sort we've seen has come to play even a more substantial role than in the past. I had the privilege to be elected to the presidency of the European Parliament in January of 2002. And interestingly, when we went through the various rounds of election, there were only two candidates standing in the end, and the other was a fellow member of the Celtic Fringe in the person of David Martin, the very popular vice president of the Parliament and a long-standing and respected member of European Parliament for Scotland, and I think in particular, if I remember correctly, from Edinburgh. So my friends in the socialist group had chosen very well, because they put out two guys marking each other with very high levels of similarity in terms of potential appeal. Our votes went to 3 rounds on the day, which is pretty unusual, because frankly, the big battalions in the Parliament, the Christian Democrats and the Socialists, did a kind of democratic stitch up, where for 2.5 years, it was from one team, for the other 2.5 years from the other, and both big battalions always voted for the other's nominee. And so in a certain way, to have a vigorously contested, unpredictable contest was very interesting. And of course, coming as I did from a small state, you couldn't mobilize large battalions of voters to try to count on some big national support. And coming from the Liberal Democrat group, which was the largest of the smaller groups, you didn't have that weight either. And so I remember that day very particularly. We had 3 rounds of election, and in the end, by a very slim margin, I had the wonderful privilege to be elected. Now, to come to the Irishness, I had 2 speeches in my pocket. The speech in case I won, and of course, based on equanimity to be prepared for all, the speech in case I lost. And happily, I could reach into my winning speech pocket. And part of my speech, not a big part, but part was in the Irish language. Now, this mattered to me. The Irish language, by the way, was an official language of the EU, meaning the treaties were in Irish, key legislation was in Irish, but it wasn't a working language. So if I spoke in Irish, it wouldn't automatically be translated into the other working languages. And so at that time, what you had to do was to give a copy of the Irish part of your speech in English language or another working language to the interpreters so that everyone could hear what it was. And why did I do that? It mattered to me as a gesture of respect for linguistic diversity, for minority language, and for part of our cultural heritage. It wasn't some blow for an irredentist cultural nationalism, but it mattered to me to say this is us, not just this is me. A second thing that I did from the speech, and I remember it, again with an Irish connection, was to quote a long dead Irish saint, Saint Columbanus, who ended his days in Bobbio in northern Italy, so closer to where Brigid is sat today than to where you or I are sat, David. Now, Columbanus shouldn't be confused with Columkill of Iona, but he is of that generation. And some of the writings of Columbanus have survived, written in Latin, in a scriptorium in Bobbio in the 2nd decade of the 7th century. And one of the letters, which I won't go into in any detail, had a very interesting phrase in it, where Columbanus described himself to Pope Boniface IV to whom he was writing, that himself and his 12 disciples, his followers, who left Bangor many years earlier, were the ultimi habitatores mundi, that they lived on the edge of the world. And if you think of the Roman world as it was then known, Ireland indeed was the edge of the world. And of course, the Romans never got as far as colonizing Ireland in the way they did with England, up as far as Hadrian's Wall, leaving its legacy even today to some of the differentiation on two sides of the border in the union between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. And so I used that idea of the ultimi habitatores mundi and said that geography hadn't changed. Of course, the world as we knew it had changed, but Ireland still was the Western periphery of the European Union. And I felt this great privilege through democracy to be elected by colleagues, not anointed, not appointed, but elected to that post. And so that little thread of Irish identity and consciousness mattered to me at that moment. And the last bit I recall from that day, because it's in the same vein, I had about 80 supporters and my large family who traveled to Strasbourg. And I'm sure they were sat there biting their fingernails as we went from one round of votes to the other, wondering who would survive to the end. And they did something which isn't allowed in the visitors' gallery, but of course I was presiding, so I didn't chide them. When the result came, they let off a great big cheer as if we were all in Croke Park at an All-Ireland final day, and they hung an Irish tricolour over the edge of their seating area. As I said, not allowed, but we all looked the other way. And all those little bits mattered to me on the day. And so this issue of identity and connection, and Brigid talked in a very elegant way about Ireland finding its modern feet from early independence to what I would call matured independence. And I think a really important thing for me anyway, we have a sovereignty movement in Ireland. We've some people in Ireland who would feel very at home with Bill Cash and other people in the United Kingdom who for decades were arguing about English, or they represented as British sovereignty, but very much as English sovereignty. We basically, I think, have found a space in terms of our own sense of our own identity to be wholly Irish, but not to see it as being diminished by also being wholly engaged with the European Union. And this idea of a capacity to assimilate layered identity that comes at so many levels, from family and neighborhood, region, from nation, and in our case, this wider European thing, I think it really matters. And I think our big sense of sovereignty in Ireland, sovereignty and identity, is that our independence movement and our eventual independence gave us political sovereignty. And it took us a long time for it to mature to the point that we were willing to pool it in the circumstances available to join the European Economic Community or the common market, as was then commonly referred to. But I think it's a big differentiator between the instinctive feeling in Ireland for sovereignty and the clear instinctive feeling that never went away. Brigid referred to the splits in the Labour Party in the UK and within the Conservatives. There was always this residual sense that we gave something away. And of course you do in pooling sovereignty, you give something, but the purpose is to get something more even back. And I think our instinctive sense of pooling sovereignty as win-win is a key differentiator. And to close this little part of my kind of identity sense, I remember a fascinating dinner sometime in March of 2015, hosted in the British Embassy in Dublin by the British ambassador. And there he had Bill Cash and other MPs over from the House of Commons to meet Irish politicians the following day. And we had a wonderful dinner where sovereignty was on the menu. And I have to say that the Irish guests and myself dined from a completely different main course as regards our view to sovereignty and sharing than Bill Cash and our British colleagues that evening. And so I think all of this matters some way to how people perceive their engagement, coming from a sense of nationality to a wider sense of European engagement. In a sentence, I would say for me, Ireland in the European Union means not that we are less Irish, but that we are more effectively Irish in the many ways that Brigid Laffan described. We got our independence, the Free State, in 1922. And it wasn't quite the ringing Declaration of Independence of Thomas Jefferson and others in the United States, but it was a major historical staging post. And interestingly, it was exactly 50 years later, in 1972, when we held the referendum that Brigid referred to, where 85% voted positively to embrace the engagement with the European Union. Now, it was greatly facilitated by the fact that our main market, the United Kingdom, was going in at the same time. And I would say in a kind of a way, I've always regarded that embrace of Europe in 1972 by an independent Republic of Ireland as a kind of declaration of interdependence, a word and a concept that Brigid referred to. Can I go back a little bit? Tony talked about this and Brigid also. I was a schoolboy in the 1960s, 4 decades into our Irish independence. And it's important just to locate where we were. 75% of all Irish trade, substantially agricultural, but not only, was still with the old colonial mother country. 3/4 of all our trade. We produced cheap food along with the Commonwealth to be consumed on the urban British market. And our dependence on the UK was virtually total. Indeed, there are interesting echoes today as Britain talks about negotiating a new trade deal with Australia, about some of that past perhaps arriving back to do with the ease of access or the prices available for Irish agricultural and food exports in Britain, but also for British farmers and fishermen in Britain as well. Our currency at that time was linked to sterling. And even if we didn't need to do it, if Britain devalued, we devalued. If Britain was overvalued, we were overvalued. Our surplus labour, and unhappily our economy was in such poor shape, with lots of surplus labour, emigrated primarily to the UK, in effect what was a common labour market. And so I would say when I was a child, politically we were independent, but economically we were unfree. We were reduced to the status of a stagnant region of the wider regional British economy. And Brigid put her finger on this. We were the poorest member state of the EEC9 in 1973 when we joined. Now we've come a long way, and the 2 colleagues who've spoken before me have dealt with that, so I won't go through those elements. But I do think for we Irish, the past truly is another place. Those who left through emigration moved on from that past. But those who stayed at home have equally moved on from the past. And I think there has been a flowering and growth in Irish self-confidence. It came through education, for sure. It came through television that we didn't have earlier. It came through travel. It came through what opened up to us in terms of more income and more spending power. And a great deal of that came because of our decision to join the European Union or its predecessor organizations. There was a good bit of our political debate, I would say, focused on EU transfer policy. They would write the check and we would get it. But we used those checks well. But I'm bound to say, if you look at the economic numbers, the truly muscular effect of EU and Ireland in EU was trade growth, job opportunity, and trade diversification. We now export, I think, less than 18%, maybe since Brexit even less, of all of our exports to the UK. Imagine that 40 years ago, that was more than 75%. It is a radical change. And that radical change, of course, took time. Of course, there were misalignments that had to be ironed out, the creases had to be ironed out, but there's no doubt that we found our feet there. Reference has been made several times, so I won't develop it in detail, to Northern Ireland and the peace process. But I think it's really, really important to understand the context changed between Ireland and the UK when we were inside the EU together. And Jean Monnet remarked, many decades ago, that when you change the context, you change the problem. And so now we had Irish Taoiseach and British Prime Ministers sitting as co-equals. I don't hear talk about the size of your GDP, the scale of your population, but in principle, sitting as equals at the summit tables in Europe. Our ministers meeting their British counterparts. And I can tell you, I recall, if you look at the public records that have been revealed to us, of course, in the past decade, after the shocking Bloody Sunday incident in January of 1972, Jack Lynch, the then Irish Taoiseach, phoned Ted Heath, the then British Prime Minister, who in essence said, clear off, it's none of your business. This is about British sovereignty, and Northern Ireland is us, not you. Think of the sea change that brought John Major to work so closely with Albert Reynolds, and then Tony Blair to work so closely with Bertie Ahern. A huge part of that was people who knew each other as equals at European tables. And I think Brexit is a huge rupture. And the biggest part of the rupture that's difficult yet to quantify is our absence from those same tables. Of course, we will have Anglo-Irish symmetry, but there's a different quality to what's happening. And I think that will play out. But we've made our strategic choice. And I agree here with Brigid and Tony. We've made it. We are English speaking, or business friendly, we're Euro currency, and we're in there come what may. And we've made that bet. A last thing I would say about the Irish, I don't know if the Scottish share this or not, it would be interesting to pick it up. I think we've shown a remarkable capacity to change, and to change without lots of nostalgia. We had our independent Irish currency, the Irish punt. We let it slip away quietly into the night and at super fast speed. We had a transition plan for the Euro rollout. We did it, in an E-type Jaguar at accelerated speed, and dumped the currency that was, 1 mark of our sovereignty and so on without a second thought. I think we saw something similar to do with radical change, not overnight, but, still radical in the context of where we came from, to do with the referendum results on gay marriage and abortion. And I think it took us a long time to finally shake off the yoke of the weighty conservatism of the institutional Catholic Church and all the things that surround that, which, I don't need to go into. But in saying all of this, I'm describing an Ireland with a new self-confidence, a new kind of energy as it stepped forward, and a new self-confidence to be a different kind of Ireland. And so I think, talking to you, and thank you for the invitation, at a time when Scotland is contemplating its own crossroads with its own future, one of the things that I think really matters, and it mattered here to us in Ireland, it would be the Jeffersonian principle from the US Declaration of Independence. He talked about holding some truths to be self-evident, but he went on to write that to secure these rights, so life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Of course, today we have to have a wider gender appreciation, but I will quote, are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The consent of the governed in Ireland, serially, but with 1 or 2 blips on Nice and Lisbon, said, yes, sir, we're up for that. The government, with that consent, said, yes, this is our location. And so that's where we are. And I think these issues of independence, identity, sovereignty, growing self-confidence, they're all part of the weave, the weft of all that has brought us to this point, with lots of issues and challenges on the way, and many more, I'm sure, to follow. But I think Ireland is a more self-confident place, happier in its sovereign skill by virtue of its intelligent interdependence with its European neighbours. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that, Pat. And actually, it's an opportune time for me to say, just on behalf of the European movement in Scotland, we'll be talking about different scenarios here, but we are studiously neutral on the issue of whether we stay in the Union or whether we go independent. But it's interesting to observe some of the hypotheticals in that case. I'm just going to tack back with the two of you here, because you know, it's funny the way all three speakers addressed this. Was you did that chronology, the really importance of, you know, in some ways to me as an Irishman as well, how dirt poor we were, and now look at us, you know. And we're leaving aside the hubris of that or whatever. Leaving that aside. But do you think that in some ways it's all very well, I'll say, haven't we done well and we're taken seriously in Europe? But it's easy to be taken well when you've worked hard and you made a lot of money. And do you think we would have the same influence were we, you know, just a country that joined poor and stayed pretty poor, but still a pretty loyal member? I'm just going to throw that to Brigid first, and then Pat, if you could join in afterwards.
So I think that our standing. So Garret FitzGerald was the first Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs. And Garret was firstly a Francophile, but also very European in instinct and culture. And he was very clear that poor Ireland had got to also play its role. And he said Ireland is a demandeur on the system, but we must be as communitaire as possible and supportive of the system as possible, because we are also a member state. So interestingly, from the beginning, including with the 75 presidency, the Irish have never stinted on the contribution they need to make to the collective, and always had respect on that basis. Also, the second thing that runs through the Irish approach, and that is an acute consciousness of reputation. What do I mean by that? The bailout was an enormous shock to the Irish state elite, because Ireland had never needed this before. It had never basically had been out of the markets before in anything like this way. So it was constantly attentive, even when a developing member state, to make sure that the structural funds were used properly. And so I think that it does matter how you approach membership. Now, Greece is the great contrast. Portugal has made a very good hand of membership, as in my view has Spain. Greece is the country, I think, that has struggled more than many Central European countries in terms of membership. And I think that came somewhat from a cultural, the irony of being the seat of the civilization, the European civilization, but yet from the foundation of the Greek state needing to be bailed out every 50 years by foreigners, and the lack of agency. So I do think that our use of membership has mattered, but I think we always played our part, even as a poorer state.
Okay, Pat.
When I was president of the European Parliament, my main focus of attention was the imminent Big Bang enlargement of the European Union. And so that took me on multiple visits to every accession state of the Union at that time. And that, of course, took me to countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Cyprus, Slovakia, Slovenia, Czech Republic, and so on. There was, everywhere I went, I would come with what I might call my EU evangelist's speech. But everywhere I went, the questions were about Ireland. They were utterly fascinated. How did you do it? Now, maybe we're fascinated ourselves. We have to answer. We don't know ourselves entirely how we did it, but there it is. We are where we are, as it were. And in fact, I would contest the view that to talk about that comparative success is hubris. We definitely had our hubristic moment, and that was the Celtic Tiger at its peak, when, in general terms, including in political terms, we lost the run of ourselves. But I think this is a grounded, fact-based quality which speaks for itself. And there has been great interest in how we did it. So there was great interest in how the Industrial Development Authority of Ireland worked. There was great interest in what kind of incentive and disincentive systems you had to do with industrial and service sector development. There was great interest in how, in diplomatic terms, Ireland operated the EU. So when you went to the EU Affairs Committee of a Parliament, they wanted to kind of reverse engineer a little bit. What was the story? What could we learn? What could we do? And I think what Brigid said is actually true in the sense that a lot of states, even if structurally there are so many reasons why they couldn't repeat the Irish story, they were fascinated by how this small, poor state found its feet. And this is the thing they aspire to doing themselves. So I think it has been a real benefit for Ireland. And of course, it has its counterpart. People who look at the taxes and the various elements that I think was Brigid referred to earlier. You asked the question of Tony Connolly, is there payback to do with corporate tax and so on? I actually see not a payback issue coming, but change is coming. And change is coming through the OECD. And Ireland has pinned its hat on the OECD hanger and said, well, we think it's not enough for the EU to make the change because other guys could go out and undermine it. We're with the OECD. But now Joe Biden is pumping a lot of focused energy into the OECD, and the OECD is going to deliver the goods, and we're going to have to shape up to it. Now, what the ultimate outcome will be on what will the tax rate be and so on isn't yet determined. Joe Biden's latest push in the last few days has been to suggest a minimum rate of 15%, which comes relatively close to the Irish 12.5%. So let's see what happens. But all in all, my sense is that Ireland, even with the shocking consequences of the financial and banking crisis, earned its stripes and then re-earned them, as has been remarked, by swallowing hard, doing the hard things fast, and therefore putting most of the badness behind us as soon as possible. Yes, with victims, and yes, with the need to address that. But we got there faster in the end than the guys who hung about pretending that there was a softer option or a woolly option. We got rid of the woolliness, got down to the hardcore need for change, and went about it and got out of it as soon as possible.
Thanks for that, Pat. Now, we've got some great list of questions here. Now, unfortunately, we've only got 20 minutes left, and I want to use this time wisely. So if I don't ask your question, it's probably because I feel that they might have been addressed already here. There's one that's just come in now, so I'm going to do maybe one question to each, so maybe not ask you both to address it, just so we can go through as many as possible. So back to you, Brigid. There's a question here just about the diaspora. Ireland using its diaspora well. How do you think that, do you think that's been an important part of what Ireland's done?
The diaspora has been extremely important to Ireland globally. It has meant there is something called Global Ireland. And it's interesting that when we went both the last time and more recently for a UN Security Council, then we were able to deploy across the world and try to get support. Of course, the American diaspora has been the most important in two senses. Firstly, the Friends of Ireland on Capitol Hill number 56. That's a lot of friends in a very important country in the world. And they've been deployed continuously to support peace in Northern Ireland and through the Brexit process very effectively to keep London to keep London honest, or as honest as it can be kept on this question. And then the other role of the diaspora has been, Pat mentioned the IDA, the Industrial Development Authority. Well, they're very good at hunting down anyone of Irish descent with any economic power. And not that they expect them to invest in Ireland just for nostalgic reasons, but they make the business case to them. And it was also interesting, and this is cultural, during the terrible bailout years when Ireland was on its knees, something called the Gathering was instituted. And the Gathering was a request to all Irish communities, towns and villages and counties across Ireland, to hold a gathering. And in other words, to research anyone of any importance, whoever left your area, and invite them back to a great gathering. And this turned out to be, it was great tourism, but it also galvanized and mobilized communities, developing social capital, mobilizing social capital at a time when Ireland needed tourism because we needed money. We just needed the balance of payments to improve. So the Gathering was one of those very innovative, creative ideas that delivered to communities across Ireland, both in terms of tourism, but also in local mobilization.
Thanks for that. Can I just point out, I didn't get my invite during that as one of the great and good who left. So
you're obviously not influential enough or rich enough.
Well, that's obviously it. I got hugely offended by that. Pat, the million-dollar question, and a lot of this has come up on the screen, not surprisingly, and again with due reverence to our neutrality on this thing. What people are asking: were Scotland to go independent, what would be, how would its application for membership of the EU, and would that be welcomed or not? Now, I know this is completely within your gift, Pat Cox, because you're so a senior person in the EU historically. But what do you think on that? How would it be welcomed?
It's a very good question on which I'm happy certainly to try to speculate a bit, but it is kind of informed speculation rather than definitive insiderism. As regards Scotland and EU, this I understand, and I think you're quite correct as an organisation to maintain what I call studied neutrality. But it's also important that you're not neuter, which is to say you have to allow yourself to discuss it from all angles, for sure. But Brigid and I have done lots of referendum campaigning in Ireland, and we were often very frustrated with broadcasters who interpret the requirement for neutrality to meaning one almost of being neutered, that you can't talk about some things almost at all. And I think it's very important that you give yourself and the European movement the chance to talk about it, but in a neutral way, open both to do this or not to do this. I think for Scotland, a first really important thing, and I think this is evident from Nicola Sturgeon's recent election campaign, you need, if you're going to have another independence referendum, to have a legitimate one that is not constitutionally disputed between Scotland and the United Kingdom. Now, whether this is on the way into it or the way out of it and so on, there's lots of arguments about how all this might shape up. But if you had, as you had with the referendum, was it in 2014, a constitutional legislative agreement where each party says we will live with the result, it means that it would have been a constitutionally accepted divorce with lots of the divorce details later to be worked out. So I think that's really important, because if you're applying for European Union membership as an independent Scotland, with the mandate for independence not the subject or object of internal constitutional dispute in the UK, you are then not Catalonia, or not the Basque Country, or not the wherever else. And I think it's very important not to be those in the constitutional order of the UK, should that order change, should Scotland at some moment vote for independence. That is a really important point of departure. If you end up with a disputed divorce where the constitutionality is contested within the union that you are departing, I think it would make getting in through the entry gate exceptionally difficult, if not impossible. The second part, if you go the constitutional route and you arrive at a point where you're independent and you wish to apply for EU, you are fully entitled to do so. It requires the unanimity of every existing member state to let you in. Mostly if you don't have a Catalonian style problem, that should be easier. But you need to do a huge amount of diplomacy, because there are still lots of states in the EU who fear what the French might call fragilisation, that the state could splinter some way into different regional independencies and create a different kind of statehood contrary to their constitutional order. So it would require massive diplomacy. Don't assume, work on it. But if you work on it, and if it is constitutional, in quotes, then I think it's a starter. After that, you already have been in through all the years of membership inside the system, and your legal order for the moment, pre-Brexit, was wholly consistent with the acquis communautaire, with that big body of EU law. So the more that the post-Brexit United Kingdom, including Scotland, drifts away from the acquis communautaire, the more running repair work and detailed negotiations would need to take place on going back to the original acquis that you started at pre-Brexit. And then these procedures for negotiation, because you have this kind of matured inheritance of an EU legacy, ideally should be quicker than for many other states. But they're not the quickest thing. They're quite bureaucratic. They go through dozens of chapters, I think 35 or 36. They go through dozens of checks within the chapters before you move from one bit to the next. So can it happen? Yes, in the context I've described. And it should be easier than for many others because of the inherited acquis communautaire, but it won't be the fastest thing. But in the end, it is an achievable thing in my view, but it requires massive diplomatic work, especially if you had an independent, embryonic Scottish foreign policy, diplomacy and diplomats. They would need hard and fast to get a positive message of engagement out to European capital cities as part of preparing the way.
Thanks, Pat. One for Brigid here. You talked about, that change from the poverty through to the wealth, I suppose. And one question that seems to be coming through quite a few of the comments here, the questions here, is about the lack of confidence that Scotland has, that requiring that leap of faith when 60% of our exports in Scotland at the moment go to England. Taking that, thinking of that change that Ireland obviously did, how do you think Scots would, should they take that leap of faith? How does one prepare oneself to do that?
So obviously I can't tell the Scots and wouldn't want to tell the Scots how they should vote, because they have to, that's a Scottish choice. But I think Scotland faces an unpalatable choice. It can remain in the Union and of the United Kingdom, but it is likely then to have a government in London that is not representative of the political complexion of Scotland. That London government took Scotland out of the EU with 62% of Scots wanting to remain. And that's a pretty significant proportion of Remainers in Scotland. And it isn't even so much that, but it is the manner of Brexit. What do I mean by that? London, and particularly Johnson, but also May, really paid no attention to the need for a national consensus, cross-union consensus following the Brexit referendum. This is the choice of the English and to a lesser extent the Welsh. And so that is a trauma, that's a political trauma. Now, how serious is that? I think that's up to Scotland to determine. Then on the question of independence. There is, of course, it would be a rupture, it would be, there will be friction, it would require an enormous national effort in Scotland to make a success of independence. Can Scotland do that? It already has most of the institutions of an independent state. It's got a separate educational system, it's got a legal system, it's got a parliament, it's got a government. So it isn't as big a leap for Scotland to be independent as it would have been for Ireland to establish an Irish state in the 1920s off the back of a war of independence and a civil war. So will come down in the end to identity, to the project for Scotland's future. Is that a member of the United Kingdom or not? And then it really can't be economically driven, because Brexit hasn't been economically driven. That doesn't mean, I mean, Scotland should be capable of being a successful small European state like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Ireland, the Netherlands. These are all countries that are within a couple of hours of Edinburgh. So what would be uniquely different about Scotland to suggest that Scotland couldn't be like those countries? But of course, it does require that leap of the imagination. It does require that sense of purpose to make a success if there was to be an independent Scotland. So there's nothing easy about any of this. But I go back to the impact on Scotland long term of the potential development of a grievance culture, whereby you have rule from London, but London is alien. And for me, that grievance culture is very destructive of agency and very destructive of ownership. So you take your chances. You take your chances.
Thanks very much for that. I don't know. I think a key observation there, and in some ways, you know, just to throw in my point there, definitely that allowed Ireland to escape that which was poisonous to Ireland's self-confidence, was that feeling in relation to the UK. And I think that's an important point that you make there. There's a question here: if Sinn Féin, I can't even pronounce them properly, if Sinn Féin becomes the political party in government in Ireland, will this change the relationship with Europe? Pat Cox, quickly.
Sinn Féin have been instrumental in virtually every referendum campaign in recommending people to vote against the available Europe, which may never be ideal, but it is the only one available. I think if they were in government, they would be forced to deal with the pragmatic consequences of a government not addressing those kinds of things. They talk about themselves being Euro realists as an attempt to distinguish themselves from Eurosceptics. But I think realism in an Irish context, in the light of all that went before in our conversation, would compel any Irish government to understand, if I might say, where its bread is buttered, where its net interests lie, and it would be wholly unconscionable for any Irish government to seek to uproot Ireland from the centrality of its European relationship, especially in the context of Brexit, where the nearest available alternative would be even more unpalatable in contemporary terms than its inherited legacy was in historical terms in the past.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a quick 30-second question to both of you now, just to sum up very quickly. If there was one thing that Ireland could teach Scotland or help Scotland with, what do you think it would be, Brigid, in its move forward in deciding these relationships?
Small states better be smart.
Okay, thank you. Pat?
Seamus Heaney's last dying words to his wife: Nolly timere, don't be afraid.
I don't know what way that's pointing at all. Well, thank you very much to our panelists, Brigid Laffan, Pat Cox, and of course, Tony Connolly. Thank you very much for joining us. I should point out at this stage that we have plenty more webinars. So if you go to the EMIS website, you can find details on those. I think there's an opportunity on the through the webinar here to donate money, because it costs a wee bit to put these things on. And I've been told that they're, just to point out, I get a message here, it's politic to point out that Glasgow Loves EU are showing a rerun of their interview with Pascal Lamy this evening at 7:30 p.m. I think you'll have to go to their website to do that. So without much ado, I'll say goodbye to you all. Thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Cheers, Pat.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.